Hello and welcome to this webinar, Fighting Hunger with the Child Tax Credit, Actions and Updates for Advocates, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC. I'm Steve Hayward, FRAC's Senior Communications Coordinator. Before we begin, I want to cover some housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 30 minutes. However, we are recording the session and will send the recording and slides in a follow-up email, so you will still receive all the information even if you have to hop off. After the panelists have made their remarks, there will be time for questions and answers. To ask a question, please use the chat function on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. With that, I'll pass it off to Alex Ashbrook, Director of Root Causes and Specific Populations at FRAC.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful that you're here today to learn more about how important it is for our anti-hunger advocacy work to help families avail themselves of the expanded child tax credit, and just as important, advocate to make sure this child tax credit, an incredible vehicle to reduce hunger and poverty, is made permanent. Next slide, please. So please join me in welcoming FRAC's Allison, Lasso, and Emma. But just for a moment, a quick word on FRAC. We work to end poverty-related hunger. And as you can see, the CTC is a critical policy to do just that. And our great presenters will share more on why this is the case. Next slide. So join me in welcoming FRAC's Allison Lasso and the Children Defense Fund's Emma Mehrabi. Sorry, I'm butchering your name. Since we only have 30 minutes, I wanted to save time for questions and also allow our presenters to share their expertise. So I'll forego sharing their full bios, but you can get that information on FRAC's website and the Children Defense Fund's website. Next slide, please. So based on today's agenda, we hope that you will leave with basic information on what the child tax credit is, an overview of research on why it is so fabulous, and advocacy opportunities to make sure families can continue to benefit from an expanded and more inclusive CTC. So now we'll hear from Emma on what the CTC is and how it's changed from the more traditional CTC. Take it away, Emma.
Thanks, Alex. That's okay, my last name, it's pronounced Mehrabi, but I appreciate the attempt. So the child tax credit, and well, first of all, thank you for having me and to FRAC for inviting me and for organizing this webinar. I always like to say, you know, economic security programs like the child tax credit, which we see as a step towards a really a true permanent child allowance or guaranteed income for children, gets us a step in the right direction to supporting the needs of all children, not just in economic security needs and their cash needs for families, but as we're thinking about it and what we're going to talk about today in the context of how do we support children through their whole development, including hunger, nutrition, and so much more. Something that as those in the children's community, and I know FRAC can commiserate, like to say, you know, we haven't done enough for kids. So the child tax credit is actually a more than 2 decades old support for families at tax time. And it started in 1997. And at the time, it really was a $500 refundable credit. It was very small. And since then, it has an increase in really, really small increments. And historically, it's actually really been thanks to Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro for their championship of increasing this credit, even under President Bush and others throughout the early 2000s, leading up to under President Obama. And then it was increased again in 2017 under President Trump and Republicans under their Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. At that time, it was actually increased mostly for families in the higher income phases. So it went to families that making up to $200,000 for single filers and joint filers making up to $400,000 a year. So last year, you know, Congress through the American Rescue Plan Act, and thanks to support from President Biden and so many others who've been working on this increasing this benefit, including the child tax credit, increased it from 2,000, as I said, from that started in 2017 to 3,000 per kid under 17 and 3,600 for children under 6. And so we talk about those lump sums because historically, again, the credit has been at tax time. So it's really when your family has filed taxes, you've been able to get this benefit. So maybe some of you in the call have received it as well if you qualify based on your income. But for the first time ever, we saw this benefit being done on a monthly basis. So basically you would get an average of maybe $250 or $300 per child, depending on the age range as I listed above. So say you have, 3 kids, you're going to get, you could get up to $900 if you have 3 kids under 6, or even more. And even if they're not your children, if you're a grandparent or you're a caregiver, as defined by the US code, you would still be able to receive that money. So that monthly benefit really went from July 15th to December 15th of last year. And although many of us would have liked to have seen it a full expansion for a full year on a monthly basis, it stopped in December. And so your families would receive the other half during tax time, which, as many of you know, is right around the corner. For those who have filed taxes like myself, if you qualify for the child tax credit, our hope is that you got that second half of your benefit. That could be thousands and thousands of dollars on the table. The other good thing for this year was that it increased to 17-year-olds, or for last year, excuse me. The American Rescue Plan Act bumped it from 16 to 17. And before it was only a $500 benefit for 17-year-olds, which is kind of insane as you think about how families, particularly parents and caregivers, support their kids, for many of us, right, over the age of 18. So in the long run, we'd love to see it, it increase the age. And then the increase, really, the other 2 big increases were that monthly benefit was really helping families at that increased cost up to $150,000 for married filing jointly. And then families with, they call this fully refundable, but families with no income at all were able to receive the benefit for the first time, or very low income. Previously, you had to have made at least $2,500 a year in order to receive the benefit. So we like to think of it as families who really needed help the most were not receiving the benefit. And all of those children, millions and millions of children were losing out. Previous estimations say anywhere between 23 million children, mostly Black and Latino, to 27 million children were not receiving the full benefit of the child tax credit prior to last year's expansion. And again, that just meant Black and Latino children, again, were disproportionately not able to get it. And so most estimates say that like 92% of families benefited from this expansion. So that's really fantastic, particularly as you think of as you keep getting up income range, there's a lot less children at that income range. There's a lot more families in the moderate to, or a lot more children in the moderate to low income range. Next slide. I think the next slide is me. Yes. Okay, so what I'm showing you is like one impact. I know Allison is going to go over a little bit of like the impact on hunger. So there's lots of impacts on the child tax credit. So for this webinar, we just are going to focus on the child poverty impact because of timing. So the Columbia University Center on Poverty actually does monthly benefit or monthly child poverty estimates. And it was really helpful for us as advocates. And then I think just like the general public to know, what is the impact on child poverty overall per month with the benefit. So as you can see, this estimate is from January 2020. And so it actually, we can see exactly what happened in December, which was the last check, December 15th. And then January was the first month that there was no payment. And so as you can see for children overall, it spiked from 12% in December to 17% in January, and huge percentage increases too for Black and Latino children as well. What they don't have here is Indigenous, and part of that is because they don't have, like the census, they don't have the enough of a population database to do that. So just a few things. As we look at this overall, in July, their first estimate was that the child tax credit kept 3 million children out of poverty. In December, it kept 3.7 million. But this estimate shows that we have a huge increase to child poverty in January. And then in February, it went down to 3.4 million. So over the next few months, we'll actually probably see, just in looking at projections, we'll actually probably see a continual decrease of child poverty. And part of that is because families are going to be receiving the second half of their payment during tax season. So as we look to like March, April, May, probably through the summer, the delivery of that payment will just result in a temporary, but not hugely substantial dip in child poverty rates during the spring and summer. The other thing that this doesn't account for, as you look at the numbers, if you're just like looking at this chart, is it doesn't count for inflation. So, you know, poverty impacts and other data are impacted by inflation, but this does not account for that. And there's, I don't know of another model that does, but it's important to think about as you all are thinking about, and probably for your own families, you know, how much inflation, which some estimates say close to $300 a month that were, you know, being felt in our pocketbooks, how that also impacts child poverty. And I think it's back over to FRAC for the next one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emma. I mean, this slide really crystallizes how critically effective and important this expanded child tax credit is in reducing poverty. I mean, when you look at these numbers, it's just astounding how effective it's been. And the anti-hunger advocates on this call know how important addressing poverty is to ultimately ending hunger. But we wanted to give you a window into how the child tax credit has been really important in addressing hunger. So I'm going to share the next slide, please, and introduce again Allison Lacko from FRAC.
Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to quickly go into the impact specifically on hunger. And next slide, when I'm talking about hunger in this presentation, I'm using the measure food insufficiency from the Household Pulse survey data, which some of you may be familiar with, but it just refers to a household reporting that they sometimes or often did not have enough to eat in the 2 weeks prior to when they received this survey from the census. Next slide. Okay, so this is looking at food insufficiency rates from the beginning of January, the beginning of 2021 through the present day using the Pulse data. And throughout this period of time and throughout the entirety of the pandemic, the rate of hunger among households with children has been higher than the average household in the United States. So this graph is showing food insufficiency for the two groups, and also when the CTC expanded monthly payments were going out. Next slide. So I want to point out that after the CTC was first distributed, there was a notable and steep decline in food insufficiency among both groups, but especially among households with children. And so there was several research groups have noted that this decline was statistically significant. We linked to a bunch of these resources in a primer that we put together that I just shared in the chat. But it's important to understand whether that happens to be correlation, like whether that decline happens to coincide with when the CTC went out versus if the CTC payments we can say that those actually caused the decrease in hunger. So a couple of studies have been really important in our understanding to this. So next slide. The two studies that I am putting here are particularly important because they control for things like the types of households that responded to the survey, the timing of the payments, and that means that they can more definitively say that the child tax credit caused lower rates of food insufficiency rather than that just being correlated. So the Parallel study, the first one there, is from the Columbia University group that Emma just talked about, looking at the reduction in child poverty due to the CTC. So in their study, they found that the reduction was about 26% mostly concentrated in households with an income below $35,000 a year. And they found the reduction was greatest among Latinx households. The Schaefer study came out in JAMA a couple of months ago, and they used a variety of statistical methods to see if they got the same result, regardless of the method that they use. And regardless of the method, they did find that we can say that CTC caused a reduction in food insufficiency. Next slide. I also wanted to point out, in looking at these trends, that we're seeing a much steeper increase since the CTC has ended in food insufficiency among households with children. So as a baseline, if you look at the US average, it's only increased 0.1 percentage points from January of this year, 2022 to March of 2022. But if you look at the change in households with children, it's gone up an entire percentage point. So there hasn't been that kind of rigorous statistical research yet to be able to kind of understand if this is causation versus correlation. But it is a trend that is worth noting, that we're keeping our eye on, and further research is needed in this area. Next slide. So it's important to combine the kind of quantitative data that we see with hearing directly from families. As part of the pulse survey, they do ask respondents to identify the major sources of spending where their CTC benefits go towards. And from July to December, over half of respondents consistently reported that one of their major expenditures was food. I do want to point out that they report directly using CTC payments for food, but to bring this back to what Emma was talking about, poverty reduction, and what Alex mentioned, we know that one of the main causes of hunger is poverty, and that people get caught in a vicious cycle. So for example, either losing a job or not having access to a well-paying job causes poverty, or high expenditures, especially in the context of inflation, cause poverty. Poverty in turn makes it more difficult to afford food and leads to hunger. But hunger also makes it difficult to maintain either your studies or employment or good health, and that further perpetuates the cycle of being stuck in poverty. So the income from the CTC may have directly been used for food, but also by indirectly impacting other expenses and reducing poverty, the income from the CTC is important in helping families break this cycle. So next slide. I wanted to close my segment of the presentation just by sharing some quotes from families about what the CTC has meant to them. And the data from this comes from Propel. They run this app called the Providers app, and it's for SNAP customers, and it helps them monitor their benefits. It connects them to other resources. And every month since the beginning of the pandemic, they've distributed a survey to a random sample of their about 5 million users that use the app. So with the CTC, they asked people, what does this mean to you? How are you using it? And people used it to pay utilities, to pay for back to school expenses, to just cover expenses when they unexpectedly lost work, whether due to COVID or not due to COVID. So these are just some examples of quotes. And they have also, on their website, you can also find some insights from asking families in January of 2022, after the end of the benefits, sort of like, what does that mean for you now returning to not having these monthly benefits? And one of the main types of feedback that they got is it being more difficult to afford food. And with that, I will turn it back to Emma.
Thanks, Allison. And just another note about data generally. We are involved in a group national survey related to measuring the child tax credit. That's something we didn't get to talk about today. Is just like outside of when we talk about child poverty, which also is a measure in time related to the federal poverty standards, as well as hunger. There's also other things to think about too, not just how important it is to collect stories, but how we're measuring it against child and family well-being, how it measures against financial stress in the family, stress overall for the family or the child. Does it build trust in the government? Does it help families pay their bills, et cetera? So there's so many other indicators as we think about how you're measuring the child tax credit or other economic security programs. So again, we didn't get to talk about today, but just something to be mindful of. So we're going to talk a little bit about just some, as I close this out, just who was likely to claim, what the road ahead looks like, and how you can help. So as of December 15th, which was the last payment, 61 million children and 35 million families benefited from the monthly payments each month. So either received them automatically or they signed up using either the IRS non-filer portal or the Get CTC portal that was organized by Cook for America. And again, as I said earlier, families that didn't receive any of the monthly benefits, either because they opted out of it, which you could do, but some people weren't aware of it, or because they had never filed their taxes before, happened in a long time and still weren't aware of the monthly benefit, they can still receive it at tax time. And tax time for everyone who's had to file taxes ends on April 18th, although you can get an extension through middle of October. So this isn't what I'm going to tell you right now, isn't a comprehensive review of all the families who maybe had missed out, but like I said, families who don't regularly file taxes, and those are families at lower incomes, adults with lower incomes below 25,000, which those families qualify to use the simplified filing tool or the non-filer portal, depending on how you describe it. It's just a way to file your taxes much easier in a simple process. And then no surprise, families who families of color and from marginalized communities. Next one. Thank you. So yeah, the road ahead, which is like very elusive and precarious at any given day. So what I'm going to talk about really quickly is just like what was in the Build Back Better Act, which we're now calling, I guess, an economic package or an inflation package, depending on who you talk to, but what was in the House Fast version from November, because that's like our baseline that we're fighting for, and it was only a year extension. So that extension that did not get signed into law really just extended what was in the American Rescue Plan Act by 1 year at the higher cash boost and it made it monthly. To many advocates, including the Children's Defense Fund, benefit and our strong advocacy, it did make it fully refundable, again, permanent, which means families at the lowest income would receive, or no income at all would receive the benefit. Very importantly, it restored access for immigrant children. About 1 million immigrant children or more do not get the child tax credit because they don't have a Social Security requirement. They don't have a Social Security number. And you have to have one for kids, unfortunately. So repealing that is really important. And previous to the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, children who did not have Social Security numbers or had ITINs were able to get it. It increased funding for outreach and enrollment, which is always critical. Expanding access doesn't, or expanding eligibility doesn't always mean expanding access. So it's really important that families know about it on the ground. And it helped a little bit more protect some families from owing money to the IRS. And actually, last thing I'll just say is that, we're still fighting for all of these things. And it's really critical that, as I talk about the next slide, just that that you have to use your voice as well. And that we're doing as much advocacy as we can to ensure that the child tax credit stays in whatever reconciliation or economic package that the Senate is cooking up. Next slide. Yeah, so obviously what's currently being discussed is that we, both in the State of the Union, I forgot to put this, but in the president's budget as released, only I think last Monday, they did call for extending the child tax credit. So that was very important that we heard that, because we need to ensure that everybody in Congress is still talking about the child tax credit and keeping it on the table, because it's one of the most impactful things that families have felt in this short period of time. And as I said before, the power really does lie with the Senate to start negotiations. Some people are thinking about how we appease Senator Joe Manchin, who has not been a huge fan of the child tax credit and wants to see it in a smaller size and to go to less families. And then the timeline is just really unclear. We have been really clear, I think, as advocates, to ensure that We don't have things in the package like work requirements or removing eligibility for immigrant children, or really cutting the size or the benefit amount in half, because that would just dramatically decrease the amount of children who would benefit as well. Next slide. So how you can help. There's a lot that we can talk about in terms of advocacy and community organizing, outreach and sign up, which I'm gonna focus on in the next slide. Sharing your story or the story of someone you know who's impacted, or encouraging them to use their voice. And then I just put a reminder here on how important it is to think about what you're advocating for and ensuring that parents and caregivers have the things that they need to help their children. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus really quickly on tax filing for the rest of the year. Next slide. So really, again, we are almost at April 18th. April 18th is not that far away. And so again, it is so important that families claim the second half of the payment or the full CTC, depending on what they did last year, to get the benefits. I mean, these are the benefits that are owed to them. This is federal money that's on the table, and families need to know about it. Again, unless they file an extension, they should try to claim that benefit. There's a few things here that we've included for resources, but I did just want to point out a few things. One, having a navigator or talking to, if you are in a community where you are looked at as a community leader, or you know of other community leaders, whether that's your church or maybe a physician around that people trust, or maybe it's a teacher or a principal or whoever in your community, or maybe multiple people in your community who are real leaders, talking about the child tax credit to families who maybe are hesitant to file and claim those type of benefits because they're worried the government is going to go after them, which is one of the #1 claims that we've seen about fear of filing, is just really important. So just talking to people, like you talk to people about everything else, right, is a great way to start a conversation on why it's important to get the benefits that are owed to you. There's a few other examples that we've seen that have been really successful, in addition to community navigators, which we just talked about, is getting your government, whether it's your local or state government, to text families who are on other government benefit programs has been found to be critically important, also very successful in helping families claim those benefits. We've seen it in our state office in Ohio. We've seen it in states that have worked in, including Massachusetts and Michigan. And a lot of other states are starting to take it up because you reach a lot of people in a short period of time and in a really easy way. You could also just directly work with your local, like Social Security offices, or again, other public benefit offices to distribute flyers, or maybe you want to host an event in your neighborhood or your local community center that's solely focused on filing taxes. One thing to note is that for some families, like referring them to a VITA site or referring them to the online IRS free file program may be really helpful for them, or My Free Taxes or Code for America's Get Your Refund. That may be what they need, and they may be able to do all of that on their own. But for some families, they can't use those online resources, or they don't have the documents prepared, and they may need a little bit more assistance, or they may need to have somebody help them on the computer or go to your community legal aid provider to really get them that hands-on assistance. And that's a huge gap, obviously, in how we think about how our benefits are administered and distributed and how they're perceived in communities, but also just an awareness of that, I think, is really important. So in these websites, we've included the official government website. The Children's Defense Fund has a FAQ and resources. So we have FAQs on basically basic questions about tax filing this year, and then outreach materials as well on our coalition website. And I know we're almost at time. I will skip this just because I know we're at 1. I possibly spoke too long. So turn it back to, I think, Allison or Alex.
Thanks, Emma, for all those incredible insights and resources. FRAC also put together some resources that are geared more toward anti-hunger groups and what you can do to share outreach, to conduct outreach and make the case for the expanded CTC. I apologize that we don't have time for questions, except if you want to put questions, if you have questions and want to put them in the chat, we can respond to them over email. So feel free to do that. And I know Kate had asked about when the presentation will be available. And according to our comms team, they'll be sending out slides and recordings and an email to all attendees by tomorrow. Kate, if you need them today, feel free to email me at aashbrook@frac.org and I can get them to you today if that's necessary. All right, well, thank you everyone so much for attending, and hope we can get this CTC made permanent and connect all eligible families to this incredible benefit. Have a great day.